right, welcome to today's webinar on mastering the EU battery regulation. We have a very tight agenda for you prepared today. We want to give you first an overview of the EU battery regulation, the requirements, the scope, the battery categories, and a few scenarios. This will be done by Dr. Ulrich Spiegel, Senior Associate from Taylor Wessing. And then in the second part of the webinar, I will give an overview of the due diligence obligations in the EU battery regulation. And the EU battery regulation entered into force in 2023. The first obligations started applying from 18th of February 2024. And there's a phased application. The next phase is starting with the 18th of August. And that is when the due diligence obligations will start applying. And that is the reason for the focus of today's webinars on that topic. Before we get started, a few logistical points. The webinar will be recorded and we will share the slides with you afterwards. You have a Q&A section that you should find as part of your Zoom, where you can start asking questions already throughout the webinar. We will try to get to as many questions as possible. If not during the webinar, then at the end of the webinar. And with that, and without further ado, I want to hand over to Ulrich. Ulrich, please introduce yourself and give us an overview of the requirements of the battery regulation.
Thank you, Harald, for your kind introduction, and welcome everybody. Also from my side, I'm very happy to be with you here today. I'm Ulrich Spiegel. I'm an attorney at law, qualified in Germany at our Munich Taylor Wessing office, and I'm specializing in product compliance matters such as giving you guidance on the European batteries regulation. Over the next couple of minutes, I will guide you through the concept of the European batteries regulation, and I would like to give you some details on how to manage it. And then, as Harald already said, I will pass on to him and he will focus on the due diligence obligations coming along with the batteries regulation. The most of you, or I think I can imagine that all of you are aware that the CE marking for batteries is here. That's the reason why you are here with us today, right? So what we see is that batteries which have not been covered so far by the typical CE regulations are now covered by CE regulations. What does this mean for you and why is this topic important for you? First of all, the European batteries regulation comes with a prohibition subject to authorization. So in short words, you are not allowed to place your battery on the market unless it is in compliance with the requirements arising from the batteries regulation. So if you want to safeguard that your products containing batteries or your batteries you are planning to distribute are still allowed to be distributed, please obey the batteries regulation. But not only it is of high importance for your company to stick to the European batteries regulation, but also for you personal yourself. I'm speaking rather for the German market, it's here right now at the moment, but overall we can see it as a European concept. You as an employee of your company, you are basically only liable towards your employer based on your employment contract. However, if you are a leading technician, and at least according to the German Federal Court, it is possible to make you liable in the outer perspective towards third parties if you do not make your job properly. Meaning, if you are effectively commissioned with carrying out product compliance work, then please do it and assure that you will not be held liable, as it was one time within the litter spray decision, where the German Federal Court found that in principle, leading technicians, for example, are liable on the outside for their products to be in compliance with product compliance requirements. Beyond that, members of the board or CEOs and so on are more or less always liable that their company is acting in a legal way. So the business judgment rule, many of you might know, which gives you some discretion on how to decide within your business, does not apply as regards product compliance requirements. You are obliged to stick to these rules and to obey these. Enough on the motivation why this topic is important, and not only the motivation of you as a person, but also giving you arguments why this is something your company should give you resources that you're able to care about this topic. Enough of that. Moving on to a general overview on the European Batteries Regulation. What does come with the European Batteries Regulation? These typical CE regulations, like the European Batteries Regulation, is one you can basically divide these requirements into two aspects. On the one hand, we have rather labeling and information requirements to be laid on the batteries in this case, or rather formal requirements. And on the other hand, we have sustainability and safety requirements, so rather material requirements regarding the proper design of your batteries. The battery law is not completely new itself. We are already working with the Batteries Directive. So more or less, we see that the already existing obligations are supplemented. Maybe they are broadened, or maybe they are adding up some new obligations. For example, you all are already aware that in principle, your battery needs to bear certain general information. There are new details coming with the European Batteries Regulation. For example, one big topic is the battery passport, that certain batteries will need to have something like an electronic file coming along with it and being reachable via a QR code. Furthermore, we all know that crossed out trash bin, the symbol for separate collection, coming along with the European Batteries Regulation. This is also not really new. What is new is the CE marking, which you might be aware if you're distributing products containing a battery. So the CE marking will be affixed to batteries, or it has to be affixed since August last year on your batteries. Furthermore, there are rather comprehensive information obligations as regards the battery management system. This is something which shall help users to determine the state of health and the expected lifetime of their battery. Leaving these rather formal requirements and going on to sustainability and safety to rather the material requirements. They see that the battery law comes from has an environmental point of view. If you have a look at these bullet points below sustainability and safety, you see that there are substance restrictions which might be safety related somehow, because we do not want too harming substances in our batteries. But of course, there's also this environmental aspect of not polluting our environment too much. And also the CO2 footprint or recycled content are rather sustainability, are rather environmental aspects covered by the batteries regulation. So for the first time, we have a usual, a quite typical CE marking regulation, which comes along with big challenges for environmental aspects. Beyond that, we see that the due diligence obligations we want to focus today are also covered by the batteries regulation, and that they are more or less part of the material requirements to be laid on your batteries. Harald will talk on this in more detail later on. And last but not least, we found an alien. We found an alien inside the European batteries regulation. I'm quite often saying the word batteries regulation. I'm already recognizing that, of course, the batteries regulation, one should think, is focused on batteries, right? What we see in Article 11 of this regulation is that it does not only stipulate requirements on batteries, but also on products which contain batteries. Meaning, for example, Article 11 says that products which contain a portable battery needs to be designed in such a way that end users can easily replace such batteries which are contained in this end product. Are also more or less the same with LMT batteries containing products. They need to be designed in such a way that professionals can easily replace these batteries. We all know about the right to repair, which was all over the news in, let's say, the last couple of months, at least here in Europe. And they see that the right to repair is not only this one directive which has been published in the official journal of the European Union just recently. No, it goes beyond this. They see that repairability of products containing batteries will be the new standard, and this standard will be applicable from 18 February 2027. Thinking in design life cycles, thinking in bringing it on the road within your product, this is more or less the day after tomorrow. So please also care about this important topic. I've been already talking a lot about products containing batteries. So is it only a battery being brought on the market separately? No, it's more or less, it's definitely any and every product containing a battery, also if it is built in. The European batteries regulation wants to be applied to all products containing batteries as well. This is the case because the European Union is more or less convinced of the fact that these batteries shall be replaceable, at least as regards portable batteries and LMT batteries. And therefore it makes sense, it just makes sense to classify batteries on their own. Therefore, please bear in mind, and this is already the case since August last year, that your batteries need their own documentation, even if they are implemented in a product. What does this mean? There most likely one declaration of conformity, this document stating that your product is in conformance with the European regulations. There only one of these documents were needed so far. You will need to have at least 2 documents in place in the future, and so frankly speaking, since August last year. Enough of the general overview on some of the obligations of the European batteries regulation, which was intended to somehow pick you up. Let's have, for the better understanding, a little background view on the batteries regulation. What are the targets? What does it aim at? So the aspects, the central aspects of the European batteries regulation are, according to the European Commission, that it was intended to create a standardized framework for the entire life cycle of batteries. So we are not only talking about placing something on the market, selling something, or lending something, but we are also talking about the end of the battery's life. It was about promoting the circular economy. It was not only about talking the end of the life regarding waste, but it's also about recycling. This is, of course, coming along with, let's say, political tense times we are living in, where the European Commission aims at building something like a strategic independence with the batteries regulation from raw materials, which might be gained in countries which are not always that friendly to all of the European states. At least that's what the European Union thinks. So therefore, the batteries regulation also aims at gaining strategic independence. And as third aspect, the European batteries regulation wants to reduce environmental and social impacts, especially regarding the critical raw materials, which are also subject to these due diligence obligations Harald will talk about. At the end of these aspects of consultations, we saw that on 12 July 2023, we got the new European batteries regulation. For the time being, it is implemented as far as needed in the 27 European member states. Why as far as needed? As regulation, it is directly applicable within the member states without a really need for implementation on the one hand. On the other hand, we see that things like sanctions or authorities and also the details of the due diligence obligations are to be covered by the national law. For example, the German draft implementational act foresees sanctions of up to 500,000 euros per case of a violation against the European batteries regulation. So once more, some motivation for you to stick to the requirements. No one says it better than the batteries regulation itself. It is novel and it is complex. Just have a short look. We have had so far 30 articles under the batteries directive and now have 96 articles under the batteries regulation. But this webinar is not to make you afraid of the batteries regulation. It is about to give you guidelines on how to overcome the challenges coming along. And I'm always recommending ask yourself 3 questions. Who am I? What do I need to do? And when do I need to do it? The who will help you determining your role. What are you in the system of the obligations of the batteries regulation? The what is the question about the battery. Of course, these small AA batteries, for example, you can buy in any supermarket, are in another ways governed by the batteries regulation, like the big stationary battery energy storage systems we see more and more often next to wind turbines, for example. And also Harald already said in his first words, we see that we have a phased implementation of the batteries regulation. So also the when do you need to carry out the requirements and obligations differs and will become more strict. Let's focus on the deadlines for the next minute or so. As Harald already said, we are basically, the European batteries regulation is applicable since February last year. We already have some obligations applicable, especially as regards documentation. These are crucial obligations you need to obey since August last year. They need to say, you need to ensure that your documentation is in place, that you have drawn up your declaration of conformity and so on. And we see this big next step on 18th August 2025, where the due diligence obligations will become applicable. The European Union has promised to give some guidelines on this, but I think Harald will also talk to you about as regards to guidelines which are planned for February 2025. And as you can see on this timeline, we will get the batteries regulation becoming more and more, or getting more and more obligations, but not only this, also the obligations might become stricter. So an example as regards the CO2 footprint, for the time being, you will only need to inform on the CO2 footprint your battery has. On the later on, you will be obliged to have a maximum CO2 footprint of your battery guaranteed. On the next two slides, we've broken you down the respective requirements coming along with the batteries regulation. And when you have to fulfill these requirements, I will jump over these slides. As Harald already said, you will be provided with the slides afterwards, and then please feel free to have a look at these tables as well. So you know how to determine the when. When the next step is, who are you? I would like to give you some guidance on the roles under the batteries regulation. What you can see here is that the batteries regulation comes with a lot of operators in their field. There are these, we know, quite typical operators under the new legislative framework, the so-called economic operators. These are not really new operators to you if you're already selling CE mark products. But also on the other hand, once again, the batteries regulation is emphasizing its environmental background. You see that there are operators sui generis, maybe, which could be a good translation, like of their own kind. So as recycling and the circular economy are to be promoted by the batteries regulation, it is not enough to only have these rather distributed focused operators like the economic operators. We also need these operators doing all the recycling and the waste management. As this is rather a complex or comprehensive topic, I would like to guide you through these roles in a little bit more detail. What you see here are these typical and quite important roles within the distribution chain. You have a manufacturer. If it is seated outside the European Union, you will also have an importer, which may possibly likely sell the battery to a distributor, which then passes it on to the end user. So far, so well known. Also, most likely known to you are the concepts of an authorized representative and a fulfillment service provider. As a manufacturer, you can always appoint an authorized representative doing certain administrative tasks for you, and also a fulfillment service provider might be commissioned by you doing logistics works, like carrying the good from A to B and storing it for a certain amount of time. A further player in this system is the conformity assessment body. If you're carrying out your conformity assessment on your battery, you will likely involve a conformity assessment body giving you either the assurance that your battery is fulfilling certain, let's say, harmonized standards, or that your whole conformity assessment procedure is fine as it is. Beyond this, conformity assessment bodies play also a new and pivotal role, which is quite new to them, because also an importer might need these, because you need to involve conformity assessment bodies to fulfill your due diligence obligations under the European batteries regulation. I will not go too much into detail here because Harald will do so. So we have now covered the distribution side. Let's go on to the, let's say, circular economy side and operators which are acting here. A battery which is used by an end user might be taken back to its distributor or directly to a waste management operator. This waste management operator might pass on the battery to a recycler. To ensure that this system is working, we need to make someone responsible for establishing the system. Basically, one of the economic operators placing the battery on the market, the manufacturer, importer, or distributor, will also be at the very same time considered the producer. And as producer, this entity will have certain further obligations. For example, commissioning a producer responsibility organization which safeguards that management operators will collect the used or waste batteries. We see that the wording of the European batteries regulation is not ideal here, as we have this difference between manufacturer and producer. We will always have one manufacturer of a battery, the person which really manufactures the battery, which builds it, assembles it. And on the other hand, we will have a producer. The producer is determined on a national level and basically the entity which places the battery for the first time on the market of the respective member state. Meaning we have one manufacturer and within the European Union up to 27 producers. And not any manufacturer need to be a producer. It could also be that an importer or distributor is considered the producer. I understand that this is most likely something which seems a little bit comprehensive and complex, but I will give you some scenarios later on which will hopefully help you to understand this topic even better. So we have covered the waste management side, and now just to make the circle a perfect circle, we see that the recycler, also possibly a reuser, will pass on the battery back to the economic operators, which are rather the distributing part of the battery system. And then hopefully, for example, the recycled material will be built into new batteries, and these new batteries are distributed again. Moving on to some of the scenarios. An example, we have a company V which manufactures and sells batteries within the European Economic Area. This company will be considered from a product safety side the manufacturer of this battery. Whether it will also be considered producer or not is a question regarding where does it sell these batteries to. I will come back to this topic later on. For this manufacturer, the due diligence obligations and transparency obligations will apply from August 2025. Next example. We have a company called K, which markets a battery pack, which it buys from an external supplier. And this external supplier, let's say for this example, is also the manufacturer. And nevertheless, this external supplier brands this battery with the K company. In such case, the K company, Alpha, being not involved into the production process of this battery, would be considered the manufacturer of this battery. It would then have to obey the due diligence and transparency obligations from August 2025 onwards. There is one option which will most likely work to avoid the manufacturer role, and it is to make it clear on the label. The K company here should indicate on the label that the battery is distributed by the K company and manufactured by, for example, the Chinese real manufacturer of the battery. We cannot see that this is a possible solution from the clear wording of the batteries regulation, but we see it in other cases that this works. So this is something the K company here, if it wants to avoid becoming a manufacturer, should give a more detailed view and should assess in more detail. Next scenario, we have a company EI that produces drones with integrated batteries in China, and then these drones are produced in China and they are imported by the company I within the European Economic Area. This company I would be the company which places this drone, including the battery, on the market, and would, as placing the batteries on the market, be obliged to stick to the due diligence obligations and the transparency obligations from August 2025. Little reminder as regards the right to repair contained in the batteries regulation, this drone would need to be designed in such ways from February 2027 on that the battery contained in the drone is replaceable. Now on to this distinguishing between a product safety role and the producer role being responsible for the waste and recycling side of batteries. An Italian company which sells batteries, which has bought in Germany, would be considered mere distributor as regards product safety obligations, but would nevertheless be the producer with the respective obligations coming along with it. As regards the waste management side, for example, it would be obliged to register with the respective register in the member state. In Germany, for example, it would be the so-called Stiftung here. And one last example where we can see that one person might be producer for several countries. We see the machinery trader M from Germany, which buys battery-powered machinery in Asia and then sells it within Germany directly to end users in France and to its distributors in Spain. For the German market, the machinery trader would be considered producer. It is the first entity selling this product within Germany, the member state where it is seated. As regards the French market, because it sells these products onto to French customers, to French end users, it would also be considered producer. And as regards the Spanish market, it would not be considered producer because it sells the product to a distributor there, and this distributor only sells it on to the end customer. So the distributor seated in Spain would be the producer in this case. So once you have determined the role your company is in, then you are free to also have more details on the obligations which come along with this role. This is a overview for you, showing you that down in the distribution chain, the intensity of the obligations become less intense. Once again, please also feel free to have a look at our slides after our presentation, and you will see how the different obligations work out here. Last but not least, we have been talking about the who, and we have been talking about the when. Now we are talking about the what. And this is to give you information on how to determine your battery category, because depending on the battery category, the requirements your batteries have to fulfill differ. As I've already said, of course, a button cell or a AA battery will need to fulfill other requirements like a stationary battery energy storage system. So overall, the batteries regulation knows 5 battery categories, and these 5 battery categories are supplemented by 2 subcategories. We all know portable batteries. They are contained in our laptops and our smartphones. These are batteries which weigh 5 kilograms or less and are built in such devices. We also see and know the category of the portable battery of general use. This is this common format battery of a AA button cell, whatever battery you can buy in the supermarket. Furthermore, we have the light means of transport batteries, the LNT batteries. These are applicable to products or to batteries which power products like e-scooters or bicycles which are powered by batteries, for example. Then we have the SLI batteries. Those are the typical starter, lightning, and ignition batteries which are used to start up combustion engines. We see the electric vehicle batteries. These are batteries which power the hybrid or also electric only vehicles which are already driving around. And last but not least, a very big and important category, the industrial batteries. These are batteries which are specifically designed for industrial use, or any battery which weighs more than 5 kilograms and does not suit to any other category. So this rather big category will be subject, or many batteries will be subject to this category. Industrial use, by the way, means not necessarily that is only used by professionals. It is rather the intention and the size of the battery. So please make a case-by-case assessment whether your battery might be an industrial battery, depending on the environment, depending on the purpose of your battery. And last but not least, we have the stationary battery energy storage systems. These are these big container-like battery systems. We know their battery, where electric energy is stored from the grid and delivered to the grid. I will now also jump over the next 5 slides. This slide is to give you a feeling what battery category is, or what your battery is subject to, which category. And the next 5 slides summarize the requirements laid on the respective battery category. And I'm sure that not all of you are, for example, interested in SLI batteries. So I will not go into detail on this respective battery categories, but leave this up to you to have a detailed reading at home what the requirements for your batteries are. I'm very happy to pass on to Harald now, which will cover with you the very exciting topic of the due diligence obligations.
Thank you, Ulrich, and thank you for this great overview of the general requirements and the roles. I think the scenarios should also give you a bit of an overview of what the potential roles are. To sum up, the battery regulation due diligence obligations apply to the manufacturers and importers. And yeah, to jump in, what does this now mean to implement these due diligence obligations, and what are these due diligence obligations? Ulrich already mentioned it on his first slide. The battery regulation is novel. There are a few new things in the battery regulation, and one of these very new things is that it's really the first regulation of its kind which moves these due diligence obligations on risk assessments in the supply chain, transparency of the supply chain, into the conformity assessment process. So the CE label on batteries, which are now required to be placed on all batteries, even those that are built into products, starting with the 18th of August 2025, also encompass the due diligence obligations. So they become part of the conformity assessment. But what are these due diligence obligations exactly? In a sense, we can think about the due diligence obligations of the EU battery regulation of a first application of the CSDDD. They are very similar, and we on this slide here are showing on the left-hand side the due diligence obligations as they are laid out in the battery regulation, Article 49 to 52, and comparing them against the corresponding articles in the CSDDD. If we start out with the first two obligations, these are the ones we consider of lower complexity, as they are quite standard and similar to due diligence obligations you see also in the German Supply Chain Act, Norwegian Transparency Act, also governed by the OECD guidelines and UNGPs. So these are, on the one hand, the requirement to adopt and communicate the battery due diligence policy, to assign internal responsibility. Battery regulation specifically mentions also to top management, and to keep the documentation and the records that are accrued as part of the due diligence for up to 10 years. The second one is that the battery regulation is also specific about the requirement to incorporate the battery due diligence policy, including risk management measures, into supplier contracts. This could be code of conduct, but also specifically supply agreements or supplier contracts. This is not exactly matching the wording in the CSDDD, but it is very similar to the Article 7 policies and management system of the CSDDD. If we go to the next due diligence obligations, we see already some more differences appearing. So looking at the next three obligations, we have in Article 52 the requirement to publish an annual public battery due diligence report, which also includes findings of adverse impacts, particularly actual adverse impacts that were identified and how they were addressed. So this is potentially can be included or merged with the sustainability statement of the CSRD, but certainly this requirement for the annual public report must be fulfilled. And the specifics about reporting on particular findings is certainly an additional requirement towards also the CSDDD Article 16. The next one is on the surface to establish a grievance mechanism. This is very common. Article 9 of the CSDDD, German Supply Chain Act, includes similar provisions. There's one difference in that the battery regulation also mandates to set up an early warning risk awareness system and a corresponding remediation mechanism. So this is let's say, similar to the media monitoring and alerting provided by Prewave, but it should also link into grievance mechanisms. And the battery regulation also allows for participating in industry-wide grievance schemes and mechanisms, not just company-specific ones. Then we come to obligation number 5. This is again more similar to the CSDDD risk assessment and appropriate measures. This is the, let's say, requirement to identify and assess adverse impacts in the supply chain, both potential and actual adverse impacts. Here, specific risk categories are mentioned in Annex X. We will look at them in just a second. And based on these prioritized and assessed risks, appropriate measures must be implemented to address these risks and adverse impacts. This is quite similar to the CSDDD approach. The main difference here is, especially when it comes to the difference from the German Supply Chain Act, the supply chain and not just the immediate tier 1 suppliers. And this also brings us to the, let's say, most challenging and most complex requirement that also goes beyond the requirements in the CSDDD, and that is Article 49(1)(d) to establish and operate a system of transparency and controls to identify the upstream actors of the supply chain for raw materials listed in Annex X of the battery regulation. So for 4 raw materials, a system of transparency and controls needs to be established to have a clear view and a clear picture of the upstream supply chain. And yes, the CSDDD also has the risk assessment for the chain of activities, but the requirements of this system of transparency are more specific and they go beyond what's mentioned in the CSDDD, and we will also look at that in just a second. Now, 3, 4, 5, and 6 are requirements and obligations that are covered by the Prewave solution, and we will go into that also in the coming slides. There's one last catch and one last twist, because it doesn't end here. Fulfilling these obligations is one thing, but there is also Article 51, which requires a third-party verification of these due diligence obligations. This is the conformity assessment bodies that Ulrich already mentioned earlier, notified bodies. Think here the TÜV, DEKRA, SGS, Intertek, so the typical auditors that also work in product and material compliance. And the battery regulation now places a requirement for the due diligence obligations, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, to be audited and verified by this third-party notified body. And they will produce an audit report, and this audit report must also be shared on demand, for instance, with the market surveillance authorities, or, for instance, downstream partners in the supply chain, for instance, customers. So this is, let's say, also the very specific requirement that is not included in the CSDDD, to have this specific audit report for the due diligence obligations. And that brings us to the timeline. So today, many of you are already in the preparation phase. The CE marking and conformity requirements are already in place since last year. So the batteries that are affected should have the CE marks already on them. But now we are moving into this next phase of the due diligence requirements. And for that, we foresee a preparation phase and at least 5 months, calculating backwards from the 18th of August, to implement then these due diligence obligations. Most time should be allowed for the supply chain transparency system. Then the risk assessment to assess and respond to risks for the supply chain that was gathered. Then the verification by the notified body to produce this audit report. Here just a small note, and maybe Ulrich can deep dive also in the Q&A section, but there's actually many countries where these notified bodies that can perform these third-party verifications have not yet been notified. There's a portal. We have it also on one of the slides that are coming up, where you can find these bodies. But yeah, Germany, for instance, does not yet have notified one of these notified bodies. And then with this audit report, the CE conformity assessment needs to be updated in order to then have the due diligence included in the CE marking from 18th of August onward. There is still, let's say, some additional guidance that will be provided by the EU Commission. This is actually mandated in the regulation to happen in February of 2025. We are hearing some rumors that it might not be February 2025, but later. But still, we still expect some guidance, which hopefully clarify certain points that we will also now dive a bit deeper into. So let's first look at the preparation phase. Not going into too much detail. The preparation phase, there's, let's say, 4 key points that we see here. The first one is the assessment of the own role and scope. This is what Ulrich already presented, the who and the what, also the when. Here, particularly the questions are, for which of these battery products are you the manufacturer? For which of you are you the importer? And for which are you only the distributor? In which case you do not have to fulfill these due diligence obligations yourself. Then the next step would be the setting up of the due diligence system. So these are the policies, the internal responsibilities, certain processes to be established, who is responsible for the transparency risk assessment, is it procurement, is it compliance? We will also come to that. There's a lot of synergies here from these processes between the core due diligence processes, and also the last point here, to incorporate the obligations into the supplier contracts, as it's also mandated in one of the obligations. Then to start gathering the batteries that are in scope, preparing the data, including the suppliers where you are procuring these batteries, or if you are the manufacturer of the battery entirely, then the upstream suppliers of the components in the batteries, especially the tier 1 suppliers, but also what a tool like Prewave would need to get started. And then last but not least, as the system of transparency requires input from suppliers, we also recommend to start as early as possible with an awareness campaign for the relevant battery or battery parts suppliers, including deciding already internally on escalation procedures if they are not responding in time, because that can threaten your ability to place your products on the market with 18th of August going forward. So that was the preparation, but now let's move into the implementation phase, and particularly with an eye on how Prewave can support and how this implementation can be realized from a practical perspective. And let's start with the supply chain transparency. We showed earlier this is really the most complex requirement, as it really requires a certain transparency, and as the law says, this system of controls and transparency into the upstream supply chain. The first important point, this is not the complete supply chain for all of the components of the battery, but the Annex X of the regulation outlines 4 raw materials. These are cobalt, natural graphite, lithium, and nickel. And for these 4 supply chains within the battery, the system of controls and transparency must be established. For any other component in the battery, the casing, other chemicals, even other raw materials such as copper, lead, it is not required to set up this system of controls and transparency. So really the focus from the due diligence part is on these 4 raw materials. Now, what is, I mentioned earlier that the system of controls and transparency has more specific requirements on what data must actually be collected from the supply chain. And these are actually specifically outlined in the regulation. So what information shall be gathered now for these, let's say, yellow upstream supply chains here. First of all, the name and the type of the raw material that is procured from the immediate supplier and the supply chains that are included. So nickel, cobalt, lithium, these must be separated in this system. Then the name and address of every upstream supplier. So from the immediate supplier, of course, you will have that, but then already engaging in a mapping, and I will get into how to do that in just a second, but gathering from each actor in the supply chain that is between the raw material extraction, also the name and address of these suppliers. The country of origin information. Of course, this could be several country of origins for each raw material for one battery product. Then there's one phrase which caused some confusion, and hopefully the guidance documentation will clarify it for certain. The current interpretation that we want to introduce today is market transactions from raw material extraction to immediate supplier. What is meant by market transactions? The current interpretation from our side is that this is mentioning the in-between steps between the raw material extraction, which would be the mining operations, to the immediate suppliers. So basically giving clarity that it's not enough to just have the immediate supplier and the mining operations and mining sites where the raw material is extracted, but you also need the intermediate steps. And this we would call the market transactions. So in this case, for instance, traders, processors, smelters, refiners. So all of these steps that are in between your immediate component supplier and the raw material extraction. The quantities of the raw materials present in the battery, these we also collect from the actors in the supply chain. Then the law allows for you to also collect these third-party verification reports that you yourself must provide if you are the manufacturer importer of the battery, to also collect these from your suppliers. So there is a way for you to also, let's say, have an accelerated due diligence if your suppliers are running through the audit and third-party verification process themselves for their upstream supply chain. And the last point is, in case of supply chains that are ending or in a way beginning in conflict or high-risk areas, then additional requirements are placed that are based on the OECD guidance for mineral sourcing from conflict areas or high-risk areas. So this is a specific document in case, for instance, some of these raw material extraction steps are originating in the DRC, so the Democratic Republic of Congo. Additional requirements for the due diligence would apply. So yeah, this is the requirement, and I think this is challenging to gather this information from the supply chain. We now want to move into how we do that in practice. Some of you, maybe many of you, might be aware that at Prewave we have been engaging in supply chain mapping for quite some time, and we've always been doing that on a combination of three broad data sources. Private data, so this is the transparency that our customers give us. Many of you have already gathered some transparency of your upstream supply chains. You can provide this to Prewave. We put it into the system to build part of the supply chain. We then used and are using public data from customs data, media data, also AI-based predictions for likely supply chains, and last but not least, shared data, which is sourced through a collaborative approach with your suppliers. And based on the requirements that the system of controls and transparency outlines in the battery regulation, here we can use only the private data and shared data, meaning we must have a validated data point that is documented and the basis for the audit report for the third-party verification procedure. Meaning at the current point, and waiting maybe for some more guidance and whether that's specific, but currently based on the requirements, it's quite clear. Customs data, which is not a clear record of the supply chain, to specifically allow the tracing of the raw materials is not enough. We need to go into the particularly data collection and engagement from the suppliers. And for this, we have now developed, and I can show this to you already for quite some time, a supply chain mapping which is based on engagement with the supplier. This is supported also by outreach through the supplier success team from Prewave. So really an approach of collaboratively mapping and gathering these data points from the supply chain to have the accurate supply chains in the system. So this is the supply chain transparency. In Prewave, this can look after the data is gathered like this. We have here battery product by battery product, outlined and mapped a supply chain. Again, filtered only to the raw materials that are in scope for the battery regulation. We can have here some transparency on the quantities, the raw materials that are sourced from each actor in the supply chain. We can also, let's say, have a look at then additional data points such as the location, so the address, the name, all of these requirements that are required to be gathered are collected. But again, this is not done through the public data mapping, but this is done through the data collection and engagement of the suppliers. And for this, we have now a separate section in the tool, which is the mapping requests and transparency requests, where on a product level, you can engage your suppliers. For instance, here, SQM Europe, a lithium supplier. We are buying lithium oxide from that supplier. We are requesting them to provide evidence where they are sourcing this lithium oxide from. So we are sending them a request. And this is then a request which we can trace through the supply chain. They will forward it to their supplier, in this case, for instance, of lithium carbonate. And in that way, we are building the supply chain. And for each step of the supply chain, collecting evidence documentation. So these could be purchase orders, bill of ladings, documents that are essentially providing evidence for these transactions in the supply chain. And all of that is then the basis for the next step, which is the risk assessment. So after having built up this supply chain transparency through the mapping and engagement of the suppliers, collecting the upstream actors in the supply chain, we then are moving into the, for those that are familiar, standard risk assessment procedure that we are also using for the CSDDD, with the twist that the precise risk categories that are mentioned in the EUBR Annex X are included. And the CSDDD is in many ways even broader from a risk category perspective, but here we have a dedicated perspective to focus on the risks that are in scope by the EU battery regulation. And these risks are then used here to move from the identification, so the mapping part of the suppliers, which I just showed you earlier, into the risk assessment part, where then each of these players in the supply chain are assessed with a 360-degree scoring approach, combining the country and sector scores, the media screening, maturity and certifications, grievance and incident view into the risk assessment of the supplier to eventually move into the action planning. The way this looks in the Prewave system is the risk matrix approach that many of you know. So for each battery product that we have, where we have the supply chain set up in the system, we can run a dedicated risk analysis. This can also be combined for several battery products. And then we see here highlighted, in this case, these were the battery suppliers I showed you earlier here. Now running a risk assessment on them, highlighting them here in the risk matrix. For instance, in the top right here, two of the upstream raw material suppliers. Here a supplier for graphite, or actually two suppliers for graphite, giving us here a critical view on the action priority and the risk score. We can then drill down into why that is and where this, let's say, elevated risk picture comes from. In this particular case, for instance, it was due to several incidents happening in addition to, of course, the sector and country risk being elevated for this graphite mining operation in Kazakhstan. But we also see here that there were some wage arrears, so unpaid wages happening at this mining operation 1 month ago. And that is then, of course, the basis also to start mitigation, start implementation of appropriate measures. Also part of the battery regulation and part of the assessment process is then, let's say, a few also on additional audit and due diligence schemes that are allowed as part of the risk assessment. So there's specific mention that certain due diligence schemes can be used as part of the due diligence process. This is also part of the data that we are gathering from the suppliers. For instance, here we have a lithium mine in Chile. And under the certifications, we see, for instance, that an IRMRA assessment has been performed for that particular supplier. This is not yet one of these recognized schemes, but we believe that many of these audit schemes, for instance, on the raw material extraction, will start to be recognized also by the EU Commission, because the law really allows for that. So that is the risk assessment approach, moving from the mapping into the assessment, prioritization, and the action planning. And that is then the basis. And here we will also provide access to the third-party auditors. We will provide a report, but also selected access to the system for them to audit the due diligence, to look into the evidence that was gathered, look into the risk assessments that were performed, and for them to then provide the audit report based on the information that is also stored within Prewave. So we really aim here to provide an end-to-end process, also building up partnerships with third-party verification providers, and we hope to be soon already be able to list and mention some of these partners that have already worked with the Prewave solution for these audit reports. And then after these audit reports are done, updating the conformity assessment and moving into the compliance phase. And this compliance phase includes, on the one hand, the annual public reporting on the battery due diligence. So this specifically needs to be published on the internet. We believe also as part of the general sustainability statement, but there must be reference to the battery due diligence and the continuous due diligence. And here we also are waiting for some guidance to exactly understand the frequency of renewing and updating the system of transparency and controls, but also the risk assessment. At this point, the, let's say, conservative estimate is that it's at least once per year. This process needs to be updated, and whenever a new battery product is placed on the market or a conformity assessment procedure is completed. So that is the view of the timeline. And this also brings us to the end of the webinar, and we look forward to answering some of your questions now. I will end with one slide. We have now shown you many new requirements and many things you have to do, but we might want to end on a positive note, and that is that bringing the transparency and the due diligence into the battery supply chains brings a lot of synergies. We have the Critical Raw Materials Act, we have the Conflict Minerals Regulation, we have the CSDDD, the CSRD. There is a significant overlap between what you're now doing here for the battery regulation and what needs to be done for all of these other regulations as well. And of course, any kind of transparency that you're building into your supply chain also helps you to have a more resilient supply chain at the end of the day. So there are synergies, and we will also continue to work for you to be able to leverage these synergies. And with that, I want to thank you, and we want to now move into the Q&A section. Not sure, Ulrich, if you have already seen one or two questions you can address.
Yeah, sure. Well, we have thank you very much for all your questions. We have a bunch of questions, I would even say. So I would summarize some of these questions to, let's say, 2 topics. First of all, CE marking on batteries in any case, yes or no, or only if they are, for example, one of the questions was only if they are a medical device. No, every battery needs his or her its own CE marking since August 2024. And it also needs, and this leads me to the second question I would like to answer in this context, it also needs its own documentation. So the European Declaration of Conformity needs to be issued on the battery as a separate product. Why is that so? Just imagine a portable battery which should be repairable or interchangeable. Let's imagine a product which has built in a battery which is according to the batteries regulation, at least from 2027 onwards, to be designed in such way that the battery can be replaced. Of course, the replacing battery is more or less its own product and therefore needs, on the one hand, its own CE marking, and on the other hand, its own declaration of conformity and its own technical documentation as well. I don't know whether, Harald, you're already fine to answer a question, or should I go on and give you some more time?
I can maybe take one or two.
Okay, perfect.
So there were a few questions. So can the upstream supply chain be pseudonymized? Currently, we think it's difficult to run the risk assessment and risk response measures on an anonymized or pseudonymized supply chain. We understand that the likelihood for the supplier to respond is higher, but we see the contradiction between the requirements on the risk assessment and for you to have a view into the potential and actual impacts and not being able to see the supply chain. So this is a clear contradiction. And it's also not provided in the law that this can be completely outsourced to a third party. So this is a contradiction that we currently don't see solving with a, let's say, black box where the supplier can share data, but nobody sees it. Yeah, this is not going to be possible. Ulrich, there's also one question. What is the sanctions? If maybe you can again summarize. I think you touched on it, but maybe it wasn't clear.
Sure.
What if we don't do this until the 18th of August? What?
So basically, the sanctions will be determined by the respective member states of the European Union as regards penalties or fines. And we see the draft implementational act for Germany says that we will have to pay fees of up to penalties of up to 500,000 euros per case. And it depends a little bit on the case, and it depends on the obligation you violate. So it's not only the obligations from 18th August 2025 onwards, but already now that basically if you violate the batteries regulation once, the sanctions are in force in the respective member states, then you will be targeted by the respective authorities. Going beyond the mere sanctions, please always bear in mind, you're only allowed to market your battery, to sell it, to lend it, to distribute it, whatever you do with it, if your battery is in compliance. There is this prohibition subject to authorization that your battery is in compliance. And last but not least, if your battery should harm someone and you are not able to prove that your battery is in compliance with the batteries regulation requirements, then it is likely that at least the CEO or the member board would be also directly addressed, maybe by criminal law or other sanctions subject also to the member states.
So yeah, it's really less, I think, here, similar to other regulations about the monetary sanctions. It's about the ability to market and place the products on the European market, also to import, again, also as part of customs controls and customs procedures. Yeah, these products can be seized if they are not in conformity. I assess this properly. Ulrich, there's a lot of questions I see about the car makers. Yeah, so if I'm a car maker and I have a car which has, for instance, a start ignition battery built into the car, and I'm importing this car into the EU, what am I? Yeah.
Once I'm also asking this by myself quite often. Well, yes. Once again, go to the system. The battery needs to be assessed on its own. So you're not only importing the car and placing it on the market, you're also importing the battery and place the battery on the market. So basically perform the same assessment you do as regards the car or the vehicle also to the battery. So you are importing this SLI battery in such case, and you sell it for the first time in the European Union, or you place it on the market, then you are obliged as regards the due diligence obligations you've been talking about, Harald, but also as regards the product safety obligations arising for the importer who places products on the market.
Yeah.
And by the way, one question, so there are several questions on the right to repair or the repairability requirements on batteries on Article 11, and which also maybe there's some confusion out there. The question whether you have to design your product in a repairable way, whether you need to design it that your product, that your battery is replaceable, is not determined by the question whether your product is operated by by consumers or professionals. It is determined by the question whether your product contains a portable battery or an LMT battery. So please be aware that any product containing a portable battery needs to be designed from 2027 onwards in such a way that basically the end user is able to replace the battery. And any product containing an LMT battery needs to be designed in such a way that basically a professional is able to replace the battery. There are certain exceptions. For example, in the medical devices industry, a cardioverter or something, an implantable device would be most likely not subject to these replaceability requirements. But from a general perspective, without applying any exceptions, the question whether you need to design your product in such a way that the battery is replaceable is determined by the question what category of battery you are building in your product.
Ulrich, maybe you can speak a bit to the second provision. Yeah, it's about the first placing of the battery on the market, but then there's the second provision, putting into service, or the first one to put a battery into service. And I think some questions, maybe confusion around that. What does it mean to put a battery into service for the first time? Yeah.
Putting into service is, and I see a reference to the blue guide here as well, putting into service is also defined within the batteries regulation. I think it's Article 3, Section 18. If you have a look in there. Putting into service means the first use for its intended purpose in the union of a battery without having previously been placed on the market. So it addresses, for example, the company which imports a battery and then uses it within its own entity, for example. We have to consider two things here. On the first hand, the due diligence obligations. The due diligence obligations say, and you're the expert on the due diligence obligations, Harald, but I think they say obliged is the entity which places the battery on the market or puts it into service. So basically, these companies would be addressed by the due diligence obligations as well. And beyond this, we have occupational health and safety law in Germany, and also in the remaining part of the European Union, which says you may only operate a product if it is safe. So basically, you will also be, prior to putting your battery into service, be obliged to ensure that the battery is fulfilling the compliance requirements from the batteries regulation.
I can maybe answer a few questions, so first of all, there are many questions. Do we share the slides afterwards? And the answer is yes, we will share the slides and the recordings afterwards. There were a few questions about the actors in the supply chain. So are the traders of cobalt in scope of the regulation? Are the mining operations in scope of the regulation? And here really the answer is, I would say no. The manufacturers and importers are in scope of the regulation. And as a manufacturer, importer, if you fall into one of these two roles, you need to make the supply chain of the battery transparent until the extraction of the raw material, which includes traders, smelters, refiners. for these four raw materials, then it is your obligation to address the risks and adverse impacts that you identify. So if you then identify that you're working with a mine that has very severe human rights issues, then that impacts your due diligence, and you must address that as part of your due diligence. And that is then again included in your reporting. So you must report on these findings publicly, but you also must pass the third-party verification of the due diligence. So the auditor that will verify your due diligence will look at these risks that you identified and whether how you address them was appropriate. So let's say it's, of course, the mining sites and the maybe upstream actors are where the real risks are, but it's your obligation, as it is with CSDDD, to address these risks and assess them properly. Yeah? And again, the catch here is that it is must be audited by a third party, and that is then part of the let's say conformity assessment of the battery overall. So essentially, if you cannot fulfill your due diligence properly, then you also cannot place the CE mark on the battery. So this is how the things connect. Yeah.
That's right. And maybe I can add here something as regards the conformity assessment procedure, because we also have a question on the conformity assessment procedure where we can see that the due diligence obligations come along with the conformity assessment procedure. And this is, please have a look into the definition of conformity assessment, as I am doing by myself for the time being as well. Basically, the definition of the conformity assessment says, this Article 3, paragraph 39, by the way, it says that the process demonstrating whether the battery fulfills the sustainability, safety, and so on obligations, also the due diligence requirements of this regulation. So basically, the definition of the conformity assessment within the batteries regulation says that the fulfilling the due diligence requirements of this regulation needs to be part of the conformity assessment as well. And maybe, Harald, if I may pass on this question to you, there's this question regarding the first report. When do you think does it needs to be published, on 2026 or earlier, or what is your opinion on this?
So my current understanding is that it has to be done within a year of the due diligence obligations coming live. So let's say this public report is not the main concern currently. Yeah, so that is something you can do after the 18th of August. The main concern should be passing the conformity assessment and passing this third-party verification of your due diligence obligations. That should really be the main focus right now. Yeah.
So it would be all your understanding as well what we need to involve a conformity assessment body at a quite early stage in time, and we do not have any conformity assessment bodies for the time being, right?
Yeah, it's one of these catch-22 situations.
Yes.
Yeah. There's a question. There's already 9 such notifying authorities in the NANDO portal, but these are for other member states and not Germany. How does this work, Ulrich?
Notified bodies are not approved yet. There are 9 notifying authorities which notify the notified body. So we do not have notified bodies in the NANDO portal so far. So if you have a look at the NANDO portal regarding the conformity assessment or the notified bodies, you will find there are, under regulation 2023-1542, which is the batteries regulation, there are no notified bodies yet. And to give you an insight from the draft implementation act from Germany, it says, if I know it correctly from my mind, that the authority notifying the notified bodies will only start working on 18th August 2025.
Yeah. Maybe I can tackle one question on my side. I saw the question, what exactly needs to be incorporated into the code of conduct or supplier agreements? Is it the concrete battery product, or is it the general provisions of the due diligence? And it's really the latter. It's the general expectations, requirements, provisions from the supplier, for instance, that you require the supplier to share information about the upstream actors. That is what needs to be included into the provisions or contracts with the suppliers.
And maybe another question from my side as regards responsibility for costs. Basically, the question goes in the direction: Can I somehow allocate this responsibility? I would subdivide the answer into two sections. First of all, you will have to bear any costs which should arise towards the authority or towards the respective register. If you are addressed by the law, but nevertheless, you are, of course, if you have the possibility to negotiate something like this, to agree with your supplier, that your supplier or company you're working with bears the costs and reimburses these to you. This is something I would always recommend. Please make clear that you allocate the responsibilities within your supplier and distribution chain. Think of the right contracts in the right place at the right time, which enable you to fulfill the requirements arising from the batteries regulation.
All right. I think thank you so much, Ulrich, also for going overtime here with us and
You're welcome.
answering at least some of the 60 open questions we still have. Thank you also for your participation. We will, as mentioned, share the recording and the slides afterwards. And maybe final words. I will leave you with, we are waiting for the guidance documentation. So February, maybe a bit later, guidance should come also from the Commission that should bring maybe some clarity to some of these questions we have just discussed. Let's keep an outlook, and this will certainly not have been the last webinar on the battery regulation from our side. So thank you very much. We wish you a nice evening and see you at the next webinar. Thank you, Ulrich, also.
Thank you, Harald. Bye-bye.